Guadalcanal, October 24, 1942. The rain had turned the jungle into a living swamp. Every vine dripped. Every breath steamed. The earth itself seemed to sweat. Along the ridge the Marines called Razorback, trenches filled with brown water that reached the ankles and stank of oil, cordite, and something older, something like decay. Corporal Daniel Keaton crouched beneath a torn poncho strung between two stakes. He hadn't been dry in weeks. The Springfield M1903 across his knees was wrapped in an oily rag, the same rifle his father carried in France a generation earlier. A museum piece, the papers had said. A relic. 5 rounds, bolt action, heavy as gilt. Yet on this soaked island, where every supply run risked Japanese bombers, relics were all that stood between Fox Company and oblivion. The jungle pulsed with unseen movement, insects, frogs, the occasional whisper of a coconut frond brushing another. Beyond that, somewhere in the green darkness, was the enemy. They didn't march, they slid. Barefoot, silent, invisible until the instant of contact. Each night they came a little closer, testing the wire, cutting the brush, counting the guns. Keaton ran a thumb across the worn checkering of the rifle's stock. The wood was dark from sweat and rain, the metal smooth from years of use. The old sergeant who'd issued it back in 41 had grinned and said, "Son, this one already knows how to fight." Keaton hadn't understood then. He did now. He'd learned that in this jungle, technology meant less than instinct, and instinct meant survival. A flare hissed somewhere to the west, splashing white light across the ridge for a heartbeat. Men froze like statues. Then darkness slammed back down, thicker than before. The jungle had its own heartbeat, and tonight it felt faster. He checked the horizon. The Marines' perimeter lamps had long been ordered out. Too easy a target. Only the lightning provided flashes of awareness. Every time the sky lit up, the men saw each other's faces, mud-streaked, hollow-eyed, too young to look so old. Somewhere down the line, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else laughed softly, a brittle laugh that broke apart like glass. The air shifted. The smell of sea salt drifted inland, mixed with the faint odor of fish and cordite. Keaton raised his head. That smell meant the wind had changed, and when the wind changed, the Japanese followed it. Their scouts read the island like scripture. Before the ridge erupts tonight, take a moment, Marine. If stories like this one remind you of courage, grit, and the price of freedom, subscribe right now to WW2 Frontline Legends. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, Texas, London, Manila, Melbourne. Let's see how far the front line stretches today. Now let's go back to the ridge. Keaton eased the bolt open, checked the chamber, then closed it with a slow metallic whisper. Around him, rifles clicked in a quiet ritual of readiness. They had been told the Japanese were planning another banzai attack. Hundreds of men charging uphill under the cover of night, screaming and firing wildly. But the real terror wasn't the charge. It was the silence before it. Hours passed. The rain came and went. Rats scurried across helmets. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, echoing through the valley. The Marines waited, muscles stiff, nerves stretched tight enough to hum. The line between man and weapon blurred. On Guadalcanal, you didn't carry a rifle. You became it. Just after midnight, the jungle exhaled. Every insect stopped. The night went utterly still, a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Keaton felt the hair on his neck rise. Then it came, a single metallic click from beyond the wire, unmistakable to anyone who had chambered around. Bayonets. Hundreds of them. He steadied his breath. The old Springfield rested in the crook of his shoulder. He could feel his pulse through the wood. 100 yards out, something moved. Then a scream. Not human, not yet, more like the tearing of cloth. Then another. Then 100. Bugles shrieked from the trees as the first wave of Japanese soldiers burst from the undergrowth, bayonets gleaming in the rain. The ridge erupted. Machine guns spat red lines into the darkness. Mortars answered from beyond the trees. The air filled with the roar of battle and the metallic rhythm of bolts working in the dark. Keaton fired once, cycled, fired again. The recoil drove water from the barrel in a fine mist. 5 shots, reload. 5 shots, reload. The Springfield sang its slow, precise song. Through the smoke and lightning, he saw shapes stumbling, falling, crawling closer. The Japanese advanced over their dead, stepping into the line of fire again and again. Some reached the wire. Grenades rolled downhill. Dirt and rain exploded upward. But still the line held. Keaton's world narrowed to the circle of his sights, and the taste of gunpowder on his tongue. Every shot was deliberate. Every pull of the trigger was a decision. The Garin men could fire faster, but their muzzles flashed bright, beacons for enemy marksmen. The Springfield's flame was small, its crack sharp but quick to fade. In the chaos of night, that difference meant life. A shell landed close. The earth lifted. When it fell again, Keaton was half buried in mud. He spat grit, slammed the bolt forward, and kept firing. Around him, voices shouted for medics, for ammo, for God. One by one the voices dimmed, replaced by the wet smack of rain and the whine of ricochets. By 3 a.m., the ridge was a furnace. Bayonets clashed in the dark. The Marines fought knee-deep in water and bodies. When the attack finally began to falter, the Japanese bugles sounded again. A retreat or a rally, no one knew. Then the jungle swallowed them whole. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Steam rose from the ground. The air stank of cordite and blood. Keaton's shoulder was purple where the rifle had kicked, his ears ringing. He looked down the line and saw faces he didn't recognize, half hidden behind mud and fear. No one spoke. No one moved. They waited for dawn like prisoners waiting for sentence. When the sun finally pushed through the clouds, it revealed a landscape that barely seemed real. Palm trunks shredded by bullets, puddles that reflected nothing, and hundreds of bodies caught mid-stride as if frozen by the rising light. The Marines had fired less than 200 rounds. The ridge was still theirs, and the old rifles had proven the experts wrong. Keaton sat back against a sandbag, breathing smoke and mist. The Springfield lay across his lap, barrel warm, stock slick with rain. For a moment he thought he heard it ticking. Not metal against metal, but something else, like the echo of a heartbeat older than his own. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was the rifle remembering its first war. Somewhere behind him, a medic whispered that the Japanese would return that night. Keaton didn't answer. He just looked at the weapon in his hands and wondered how many ghosts it carried. Far out over the ocean, thunder rolled again. The day had come, but the night wasn't over. Not on Razorback Ridge. Not yet. The storm returned before dusk, rolling across the island like a living thing. By the time the first drops fell, Razorback Ridge had already turned into a shallow sea of mud and blood. The Marines worked silently, dragging the wounded down the slope, reinforcing what was left of the wire, checking magazines, cleaning bolts in the half-light. No one spoke about what they had seen that morning. Some prayed. Some just stared at the treeline, waiting for it to move again. Guadalcanal was never quiet for long. By nightfall, the jungle began whispering again. The rustle of wet leaves, the soft crunch of unseen feet, the occasional faint glimmer of a helmet far out in the dark. The Japanese were regrouping. The Marines could feel it in their bones. They had survived one night of terror, but the next would test them in ways none could have imagined. Rain hammered the ridge. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the rusted barrels, broken helmets, and the pale shapes scattered down the slope. The smell of death mixed with wet soil and oil. It was a smell the men would never forget. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before midnight, the jungle drew a breath and went utterly still. Every insect fell silent, every bird stopped calling. It was the same silence that had come before the first attack, a silence that felt almost intelligent. The men of Fox Company tightened their grips on their rifles and waited. The first sound was faint, the creak of bamboo under a boot. Then came another. Then dozens more. Through the rain curtain, shadows moved, low and fast. The Japanese had returned, this time in greater numbers, their bayonets glinting under each flash of lightning. They weren't testing the wire anymore. They were coming to break it. Machine guns opened first, strobing the trees in bursts of orange. The ridge erupted into chaos. The Japanese came in waves, charging uphill through the storm, shouting and firing wildly. The Marines fired back, but their barrels steamed and jammed under the relentless rain. Mud filled the trenches. The earth itself seemed to shift under their boots. Keaton's Springfield snapped open, brass ejecting into the puddles. He loaded again, each motion exact, almost mechanical. In that moment, he was no longer a man. He was part of something older, part of a rhythm forged in another war. Bolt back, cartridge in, bolt forward, breathe, squeeze, repeat. The Springfield's crack echoed like thunder among the palms. He moved with precision, aiming not at the charging bodies but at the dark behind them, the officers, the runners, the buglers. Every time a bugle cut through the night, he found it and silenced it. Slowly, the rhythm of the Japanese assault faltered. But for every wave that fell, another appeared. Hours dragged on. The battlefield turned into a shifting landscape of mud and smoke. Rain mixed with blood until the ridge glistened red beneath the lightning. Men fired until their shoulders burned and their hands bled from working the bolts. And still they did not give up. At one point, a flare burst directly above the ridge, bathing everything in harsh white light. The entire slope was revealed, a nightmare painting of twisted trees and fallen men. The Marines could see the enemy clearly now, faces streaked with mud, eyes wild with desperation, charging with bayonets fixed, convinced that death was an honor. Keaton fired until the magazine clicked empty, then reached for another clip with shaking hands. A shell landed close. The blast threw him sideways into the trench wall. The rifle flew from his hands, vanishing into the mud. For a heartbeat, he was deaf and blind. The world was a ringing void. When he could see again, the ridge was chaos, shapes moving in the rain, too close, too fast. He drew his sidearm, fired until the slide locked back, then clawed through the muck until his fingers touched the cold metal of the Springfield again. He pulled it free, wiped the bolt with his sleeve, and rose just as another flare went up. In its light, he saw them. Enemy soldiers only 20 yards away, stepping through the wire, eyes fixed on the Marines who refused to yield. Keaton steadied his breath, chambered around, and began again. The Springfield's report was sharp and clean, each shot echoing across the ridge like a heartbeat. It wasn't speed that mattered now, it was precision. One shot, one man. 5 rounds, reload. 5 rounds, reload. The old rifles kept their rhythm, and slowly, impossibly, the charge began to die. By 3 in the morning, the rain had turned to mist. The Japanese were still coming, but slower now, their formation broken, their voices hoarse. Some crawled. Some stumbled. Others turned back into the jungle's dark mouth, vanishing as if swallowed whole. The ridge was a graveyard of steam and shadows. The men of Fox Company held what was left of their line. They had no reserves, no relief. Only the rifles that the rest of the world had declared obsolete. The M1903, a weapon designed for a different war, had become the beating heart of their defense. Each Marine knew how it felt now. The weight, the recoil, the sound of the bolt sliding home in perfect rhythm. It was no longer outdated. It was alive. As dawn approached, the clouds broke apart. A pale blue glow crept across the horizon. The storm began to fade, leaving behind only the hiss of steam rising from the earth. The Marines barely moved. They were too tired to celebrate, too drained to speak. The smell of cordite and wet earth filled their lungs. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a landscape that defied description. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay scattered across the slope, their bayonets still gleaming in the morning light. Rifles, helmets, and broken banners littered the mud. The line had held, but at a price. Keaton stood slowly, his legs trembling. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with ash and rain. He looked down at his Springfield, its stock scarred and dark with water. Somewhere beneath the grime, he could still make out faint carved initials, letters that didn't belong to him. He ran a thumb across them, but said nothing. He turned his gaze toward the jungle. Smoke hung low over the trees. The silence was almost holy. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a single shadow slipping away between the trunks. Maybe it was an enemy scout. Maybe it was just his mind trying to make sense of what had happened. Either way, the ridge had survived, and so had he. Behind him, medics moved quietly through the mud, collecting the wounded. Others cleaned their weapons with hands that shook from exhaustion. Nobody spoke of victory. Nobody ever did on Guadalcanal. You didn't win there. You simply lasted longer than the other man. For Keaton and his men, the night had proven one thing: that courage could outlast time, and sometimes an outdated weapon in the right hands could shape the course of history. But deep down, every Marine knew the truth. The enemy would return. The ridge would bleed again. And the night, the endless, living night of Guadalcanal, would never truly end. The sun rose over Guadalcanal like a reluctant witness, spilling pale gold across the steaming hills. The night had ended, but its echoes clung to everything. The smell of gunpowder, the scorched palms, the still bodies half buried in mud. For the men of Fox Company, dawn wasn't victory. It was inventory, a quiet counting of who still breathed. Corporal Daniel Keaton sat on a collapsed ammo crate, boots sunk deep into the muck. His Springfield rested across his lap, the metal dull from rain and blood. He stared at it for a long time without moving. Around him, Corpsmen worked in silence, tagging the fallen, wrapping them in ponchos, dragging them toward the collection point. The jungle that had roared all night was now eerily gentle, its leaves dripping in slow rhythm, as if the island itself were exhaling after the storm. No one spoke above a whisper. The air carried a strange mix of relief and disbelief, the fragile calm that always follows survival. A chaplain moved down the line, murmuring prayers that the wind immediately swallowed. Keaton listened without hearing. He felt detached, like an observer looking down on a story that no longer belonged to him. The Springfield's bolt still worked perfectly. He slid it back and forth, feeling the precision of its motion, the stubborn elegance of a weapon built before he was born. Its design was simple, but its soul was something else entirely. Last night, it had kept him alive. It had kept all of them alive. And somehow, he couldn't shake the feeling that the rifle had remembered how to do it. Hours later, reinforcements began to arrive, exhausted, mud-covered Marines from another regiment. They brought word from the beachhead. Supply convoys had been ambushed weeks earlier, ships torpedoed, weapons stolen. Among the stolen cargo, crates of M1903 Springfields intended for Marine outposts further south. That news seemed trivial at first. But as the cleanup on Razorback Ridge began, something strange emerged. Mixed among the fallen enemy soldiers were dozens of American rifles. Springfields. The same model Keaton and his men had used. Same bayonets, same slings, even the same serial number series. At first, the men thought they'd been taken from American dead. Then an ordnance officer, a thin man with spectacles cracked from shrapnel, knelt beside one and brushed the mud away from its receiver. The stamp was fresh, clean. U.S. Springfield Armory, 1942. Brand new. The Japanese had captured them from that missing supply ship and brought them here, planning to use them as deception. The idea chilled everyone. The enemy had intended to mimic Marine rifle fire in the jungle, to sow confusion during night assaults, to make the defenders hesitate. But that plan had turned against them. The Marines, veterans of an older discipline, had mastered the weapon the enemy barely understood. The very rifles meant to deceive them had instead sealed Japan's defeat on the ridge. The ordnance officer called it irony. Keaton didn't call it anything. He simply stared at the rifles piled on the ground, a mirror of his own, and thought about the invisible thread of fate that tied every soldier, every weapon, to a single moment in time. For the next week, Fox Company remained on the ridge. They repaired fortifications, burned the jungle corpses to keep disease away, and waited for the inevitable counterattack that never came. Each night, the sky flickered with distant gunfire, but Razorback stayed quiet. The Japanese had shifted their focus elsewhere. For the first time in months, the Marines could breathe. When the relief column finally arrived to rotate them out, Keaton walked the perimeter one last time. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and rotting vegetation. Bullet casings glinted like tiny coins in the mud. He stopped at the edge of the wire, looked out toward the jungle, and wondered how many men still watched from out there, waiting, planning morning. He slung the Springfield over his shoulder. Its weight was familiar now, almost comforting. A Marine transport truck rumbled up the slope, carrying a handful of replacement troops. One of them, barely 18, spotted the rifle and grinned. "Old-timer's gun," he said, half joking. Keaton just nodded. There was nothing to explain. Some lessons couldn't be taught with words. Back at base camp, every rifle was inspected for damage and serial verification. Keaton turned his in like everyone else, expecting nothing. The armorer took it, flipped it over, and frowned. There, carved faintly under the butt plate, were the letters WHK, 1918. The armorer ran a thumb over the engraving. "Who's WHK?" he asked. Keaton's breath caught. His father, Lieutenant William Henry Keaton, had carried a Springfield in France. He'd told stories of Belleau Wood, of mud and wire and gas masks, of how that rifle had saved him when everything else failed. After the war, it had been shipped back to Springfield Armory as surplus. Or so the records said. Somehow, through decades of reissue and refitting, through oceans and wars, that same rifle had found its way back into his hands. On a different continent, in a different war, to defend a different world. The armorer didn't notice Keaton's expression. He scribbled a note and set the rifle aside for refurbishment. But Keaton couldn't move. The air seemed heavier, the sound of hammering and engines distant. He reached out, touched the stock one last time, and felt the carved letters under his fingertips, shallow, rough, human. It wasn't superstition. It was legacy. That night, as the camp settled, Keaton sat alone near the edge of the airstrip, watching flares rise in the distance. He thought about his father's hands gripping that same weapon, about the line that stretched from 1918 to 1942, a line written in steel and courage. He realized then that wars change, uniforms change, technology races forward, but the soul of a soldier doesn't. It endures. It remembers. Days later, a new shipment of M1 Garans arrived from the States. Sleek, fast, semi-automatic, the pride of modern warfare. The Marines welcomed them with relief. But a few men, Keaton among them, couldn't help feeling a strange sadness as the old Springfields were crated away. Those rifles had been more than weapons. They had been companions. They had names carved into their stocks, stories burned into their barrels. They had earned their rest. When the crates were loaded onto the transport, Keaton lingered by one, the one with the initials carved beneath the butt plate. He thought about asking to keep it, but he didn't. Some stories were meant to remain unfinished, to echo quietly through history rather than end neatly on a shelf. Weeks passed. The Marines moved to new fronts. Razorback Ridge faded from official reports, reduced to a line of coordinates and casualty counts. But among those who had been there, the story lived on, of how an outdated rifle and a handful of exhausted men had turned a hopeless defense into a legend whispered from foxhole to foxhole across the Pacific. In letters home, Marines wrote of the ridge that fired back, of rifles that seemed to guide their aim, of a night when the past itself rose to fight beside them. The tales grew, as tales always do, but somewhere inside those exaggerations was a kernel of truth, that sometimes history doesn't move forward, it circles back to remind us who we are. Years later, long after the war, a crate was discovered in a warehouse near Quantico. Inside, among dozens of surplus rifles, was a single Springfield marked WHK 1918. The barrel was worn smooth, the stock repaired twice, the serial number faint. No record explained how it had returned. The armory clerk who logged it simply wrote 2 words in the margin: returned home. The rifle was never issued again. It sits today in quiet anonymity, no museum tag, no plaque, just a relic among relics. Yet for those who know the story, it isn't forgotten. Because on one rain-soaked ridge in the Solomon Islands, it helped rewrite history. And maybe, if you listen closely in that silent hall of steel and wood, you can still hear it, the faint click of a bolt sliding home, the echo of a Marine's breath steadying under fire, the whisper of the jungle that never slept. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage doesn't rust and legacy never dies, then you're already part of the brotherhood that keeps history alive. Hit like, share this with someone who loves World War II stories, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends for more true-to-life tales of bravery, irony, and survival. Down below, tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment. Whether you're in New York, Lagos, Sydney, Toronto, or Manila, you're part of this global roll call of memory. Because here, every weapon has a story. Every soldier leaves a legend. And every legend, just like that old Springfield, still remembers.